You've probably grown tomatoes that turned out disappointingly small, and I'm willing to bet you made at least 3 of the mistakes I'm about to reveal. The current world record tomato weighs over 8 pounds. That's bigger than most newborn babies. I'm going to show you exactly how to grow tomatoes that make your neighbours jealous, starting with the biggest mistake almost everyone makes. 10. Wrong variety selection. Here's something that'll save you months of wasted effort. You cannot grow a giant tomato from the wrong variety, no matter how perfect your technique is. I see gardeners every season trying to get massive fruits from cherry tomatoes or regular slicers, and it's like expecting a chihuahua to win a horse race. Genetics matter, and if you're serious about growing huge tomatoes, you need to start with varieties that have the DNA for size. The varieties you want are all in the beefsteak category. These aren't your average tomatoes. They have proportionally smaller seed cavities and way more flesh than juice. Think Big Beef, Brandywine, German Johnson, Delicious, Big Rainbow, Dinner Plate, and Giant Belgium. Some of these can naturally hit 3 to 5 pounds without even trying that hard. The current world record holder grew a variety called Big Zack, which was specifically bred for size competitions. Now here's the problem. You won't find most of these at your local garden centre. You'll need to order seeds from catalogues and start them yourself, which actually gives you an advantage. Nursery plants often pick up pests and diseases between the greenhouse and the store, and once a plant is stressed, it'll never reach its full potential. Starting from seed means you control the entire growing process from day one. But remember this, even with the right genetics, you won't get a prize winner unless you optimize everything else. A big beef plant grown in poor conditions will still produce small tomatoes. The genetic potential is just the starting line. You're giving yourself the possibility of growing an 8-pound monster, but whether you actually get there depends on checking off every other box on this list. That's why variety selection is number 10 and not number 1. 9. Poor soil preparation. Most gardeners skip the single most important foundation for giant tomatoes, and that's proper soil preparation. I've seen people spend $50 on heirloom seeds and then plant them in whatever dirt happens to be in their yard. That's like buying a Ferrari and filling it with contaminated gas. Your tomato plant will only grow as big as your soil allows it to, and if your soil is compacted, nutrient poor, or poorly draining, you're done before you start. What you need is soil that drains well but holds organic matter. Clay soil that stays waterlogged will drown your roots and invite disease. Sandy soil that drains too fast won't hold enough nutrients or water. The sweet spot is loamy soil enriched with tons of organic matter, and I mean tons. About a month before planting, I top dress my entire bed with 2 inches of compost. Then after harvest, I do it again. This yearly rhythm builds soil that's absolutely loaded with nutrition. Here's an old-timer trick that works incredibly well. Composted animal manure. Not fresh manure, which will burn your plants, but composted manure that's broken down for at least 6 months. When you dig your planting hole, put some of this composted manure at the bottom, then cover it with a few inches of regular soil before setting your transplant in. The roots will eventually reach down into that nutrient gold mine, and your plant will explode with growth. The difference between mediocre soil and excellent soil is the difference between a 2-pound tomato and a 6-pound tomato. I cannot stress this enough. If you cheap out on soil prep, nothing else on this list will save you. You can have perfect watering, perfect pruning, and perfect variety selection, but your tomato will still underperform in poor soil. Build your soil first, then plant your tomatoes. 8. Insufficient sunlight. Let me ask you something. Where did you plant your tomatoes? If the answer is wherever there was space, you've already limited your harvest. Tomatoes are sun worshippers, and I mean that literally. They need direct sunlight hitting their leaves from dawn until at least mid-afternoon, ideally all day long. Not ambient light, filtering through tree branches, not bright shade, actual direct sunlight where you can see the sun's rays touching the foliage. Why does this matter so much for size? Because photosynthesis is how your plant manufactures sugars, and those sugars are what build fruit. More leaves in more sunlight equals more sugar production equals bigger tomatoes. A plant in partial shade might produce fruit, but it'll be smaller and take longer to ripen. You're essentially running your tomato factory at half capacity. For giant tomatoes, you need maximum photosynthesis happening every single day. Now, here's the exception that proves the rule. If you live somewhere that regularly hits the mid-90s or higher, afternoon shade actually helps. Once temperatures climb above 94 degrees, tomato pollen gets sterilized. The flowers might still be there, and pollination might technically occur, but nothing gets fertilized because the pollen is dead. So in extreme heat climates, a little afternoon shade protects your fruit set without dramatically reducing overall sun exposure. Spacing plays into this too. If you cram your tomato plants too close together, even in full sun, the inner foliage gets shaded out by the outer leaves. This creates damp conditions that invite disease and reduces the total leaf surface area catching sunlight. When you're growing for size, give each plant at least 2 feet of space, ideally 3. I know it feels wasteful when you're planting, but that breathing room pays off massively when you're harvesting tomatoes the size of softballs. 7. Shallow planting mistake. This next technique sounds completely wrong the first time you hear it, but it's one of the most powerful secrets for growing massive tomatoes. Most gardeners plant their tomato transplant vertically, just like it came out of the pot, buried up to the first set of leaves. That's fine for average tomatoes, but if you want giant fruit, you need to plant horizontally. Yes, you're going to lay that tomato plant down sideways in a trench and it's going to change everything. Here's why this works. Tomatoes have a superpower that most plants don't. They can grow roots anywhere along their stem, not just from the original root ball. Those little bumps and hairs you see on the stem aren't just for show, they're adventitious roots waiting to happen. When you bury the stem horizontally, every inch of that buried stem develops into a root system. Instead of roots growing down from one small point, you get roots spreading out across a huge area. The technique is simple but specific. Remove all the lower leaves from your transplant, leaving only the top third with foliage. Dig a shallow trench about 3 to 4 inches deep, but make it wide enough for the root ball. Lay the entire plant horizontally in the trench with just the leafy top sticking out above ground. You'll need to gently bend the top of the plant upward so the leaves point toward the sky. Don't worry, this won't hurt it. Then cover the entire buried stem with soil and water thoroughly. It looks bizarre for about 3 days. The plant sits there sideways like something went wrong. Then the top naturally turns toward the sun and starts growing vertically, and you'd never know it was planted any other way. But underground, you now have a massive root network instead of a small one. More roots mean more water uptake, more nutrient absorption, and better anchoring against wind and storms. All of that translates directly into bigger tomatoes. 6. Inconsistent watering. Water is where most gardeners sabotage themselves without even realizing it. You've probably seen tomatoes with those ugly cracks running down the sides, or maybe you've dealt with blossom end rot where the bottom of the fruit turns black and mushy. Both of those problems have the same root cause: inconsistent watering. Your tomato plant needs a steady, predictable supply of water, not a roller coaster of droughts and floods. Here's what happens when watering swings wildly. The plant dries out and the fruit stops growing. Then you panic and dump a bunch of water on it. The fruit suddenly sucks up all that water as fast as it can, and the skin can't expand quickly enough to hold it. That's when you get splitting and cracking. Think of it like stretch marks on human skin. Rapid expansion causes the surface to tear. With blossom end rot, the issue is that calcium can't move into the developing fruit without consistent moisture, even if your soil has plenty of calcium. The solution is deep, infrequent watering rather than shallow daily sprinkling. Your tomato plants need about 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week, either from rain or from you. When you water, soak the soil thoroughly around the entire root zone. Remember, if you planted horizontally, that root zone is now pretty wide. Water deeply enough that moisture reaches down 12 inches or more. This encourages roots to grow deep instead of staying shallow. I water once a week, sometimes twice if it's extremely hot or we haven't had rain. Daily light watering is actually terrible because it trains roots to stay near the surface where they're vulnerable to heat and drought. A thick layer of mulch, straw, wood chips, whatever you have, helps tremendously by slowing evaporation and keeping soil temperature stable. Consistent moisture is non-negotiable for growing giant tomatoes, so set yourself a watering schedule and stick to it religiously. 5. Wrong fertilizer strategy. Quick question. What have you been feeding your tomatoes? If you're using a balanced fertilizer or something high in nitrogen, you're pushing your plant to grow leaves when you should be pushing it to grow fruit. This is one of the sneakiest mistakes because more fertilizer feels like it should equal better results. But with tomatoes, the type of fertilizer matters way more than the amount. Nitrogen is the first number in any fertilizer ratio, and it drives leafy green growth. Early in the season, some nitrogen is fine because you need your plant to build a strong framework of foliage. But if you keep hitting it with high nitrogen as it starts flowering and fruiting, you'll get a massive bush with tiny tomatoes. The plant thinks its job is to keep making leaves, not to reproduce through fruit production. What you want is a fertilizer ratio that's low in nitrogen, but higher in phosphorus and potassium, the second and third numbers. Something like 3-4-6 works beautifully. Phosphorus drives flower and fruit development, while potassium helps with overall plant health and disease resistance. Once you see flowers appearing, switch to this type of fertilizer and stick with it for the rest of the season. The other key is frequency over quantity. Weekly applications of liquid fertilizer work better than dumping a huge amount of granular fertilizer at planting time and then forgetting about it. Liquid fertilizers like fish emulsion or diluted manure tea get absorbed quickly and give you more control. You're feeding the plant steadily throughout its entire growth cycle instead of giving it a massive meal once and hoping that lasts 4 months. I've seen gardeners grow tomato plants that are 6 feet tall and absolutely gorgeous with barely any fruit. Every single time they were over-fertilizing with nitrogen. Your goal isn't the prettiest plant, it's the biggest tomatoes, and that requires a completely different feeding strategy. 4. Not focusing plant energy. Now we're getting to the techniques that separate hobbyists from serious growers. This one sounds counterintuitive, maybe even wasteful, but it's absolutely critical for giant tomatoes. You need to remove flowers and fruit. I know that feels wrong when your whole goal is growing tomatoes, but hear me out, because this is the difference between 6 medium-sized tomatoes and 2 massive prize winners. Here's what most gardeners don't understand about plant energy. Your tomato plant has a finite amount of resources to work with. Only so much sugar from photosynthesis, only so much water and nutrients from the roots. Every flower and fruit is competing for that limited supply. If you let the plant set 20 tomatoes, each one gets a small slice of the pie. If you force it to focus on just 3 or 4 fruits, each one gets a massive slice. The technique has 2 parts. First, remove the first couple of flower clusters entirely when your plant is young. This forces the plant to build more leaves and a stronger structure before it starts fruiting. More leaves means more photosynthesis later, which means more resources for the fruit you do allow. Second, once you decide to let the plant set fruit, only allow 1 tomato per cluster. That first fruit to set is usually the largest and healthiest, so pinch off all the other flowers and baby fruits on that same cluster. How many clusters should you keep total? For truly giant tomatoes, 3 to 4 clusters per plant is plenty. I know this sounds extreme, but we're literally forcing the plant to pour everything it has into a handful of fruits instead of spreading itself thin. Some competition growers go even further and only allow 2 fruits per plant, focusing all that energy into potential record breakers. It's not about quantity here, it's about creating the conditions for maximum individual fruit size. 3. Overcrowding plants. I learned this lesson the hard way after losing entire crops to disease, and it's a mistake I see constantly in home gardens. You get excited at planting time, you have extra seedlings, and you think, I'll just squeeze 1 more plant in here. That decision in April becomes a nightmare in July, when your overcrowded plants are a tangled mess of disease and disappointing fruit. Crowding causes 2 major problems. First, it creates a humidity trap. When foliage is packed tightly together, air can't circulate between plants. After rain or morning dew, the leaves stay wet for hours instead of drying quickly. That constant moisture is an invitation for fungal diseases like late blight, early blight, and powdery mildew. 1 infected plant spreads to its neighbours immediately because they're all touching. I've had entire beds wiped out in a week from this exact scenario. Second, crowded plants compete for resources. Even if you have amazing soil, when root systems are overlapping and fighting for the same nutrients and water, no individual plant reaches its full potential. You end up with a bunch of stressed, mediocre plants instead of a few robust, productive ones. For giant tomatoes, Each plant needs its own territory, at least 2 feet of space in all directions, preferably 3 feet. The spacing strategy also affects how you support your plants. I stake my tomatoes individually with 7-foot cedar stakes, training the main stem vertically. This keeps foliage off the ground and allows maximum airflow. Some people love tomato cages, but I find them cramped and disease-prone because everything gets bunched together. With stakes, I can prune strategically and keep each plant's foliage spread out where air and sunlight can reach it. Yes, proper spacing means fewer plants per bed. But 3 healthy plants producing 2-pound tomatoes each will out-yield 6 crowded plants, producing half-pound tomatoes while fighting disease. Quality beats quantity every single time. Drop a comment and tell me which of these mistakes you've been making. I'm betting it's at least 3 of them. 2. Skipping strategic pruning. Pruning intimidates a lot of gardeners because it feels like you're hurting the plant or reducing your harvest. But the opposite is true. Strategic pruning is how you direct all of the plant's energy, exactly where you want it, into fewer, larger fruits instead of excessive foliage. Once you understand what to prune and why, it becomes one of your most powerful tools for growing giant tomatoes. Start at the bottom. As your plant grows taller, remove the lowest leaves progressively throughout the season. By mid-season, the bottom 2 to 3 feet of my tomato plants are completely bare stems, with just fruit clusters hanging there. Why? Because those lower leaves are closest to the soil where fungal spores live, and they're the first to get splashed with contaminated water during rain or irrigation. Removing them prevents disease from getting a foothold and improves airflow around the base of the plant. Next, prune the suckers, those shoots that grow in the crotch between the main stem and side branches. Each sucker will turn into a whole additional stem with leaves, flowers, and fruit if you let it. That sounds good until you realize it's diluting the plant's resources. For indeterminate varieties, the vining types that grow tall, I removed all suckers and trained just 1 or 2 main stems up my stakes. All the plant's energy flows into those main stems and the fruit growing directly off them. Here's the pruning move that really focuses energy. Once your plant reaches the top of your support stake, cut off the growing tip. Just snip it. The plant can't grow taller anymore, so it stops wasting energy on vertical growth and redirects everything into ripening the fruit that's already set. This also prevents the plant from flopping over the top of the stake and creating a tangled mess. Pruning isn't about removing growth, it's about directing growth exactly where you want maximum results. 1. Ignoring environmental conditions. Here's the truth that nobody wants to hear. You can do everything else on this list perfectly, and still fail if your environmental conditions aren't right. Growing giant tomatoes isn't about mastering one secret technique. It's about optimizing 10 different factors simultaneously, and if even one of them is seriously off, your results will be limited. That's why this is number 1, because it's the umbrella that covers everything else. Temperature extremes will destroy your chances faster than anything. Once the thermometer climbs above 94 degrees Fahrenheit, tomato pollen gets sterilized. The flowers look fine, bees are still visiting them, but no fertilization happens because the pollen is dead. You might see flowers dropping off during heat waves. That's the plant aborting flowers it knows won't produce fruit. In extremely hot climates, you need afternoon shade or shade cloth to keep temperatures just below that threshold. On the flip side, cold soil at planting time stunts root development. If you're doing that deep horizontal planting method, you're digging down where soil is colder. Use a soil thermometer and make sure you're consistently above 55 degrees, ideally 60, before transplanting. Cold roots mean slow growth, and slow growth means smaller fruit by harvest time. Companion planting isn't just hippie gardening philosophy, it actually works. Basil planted near tomatoes confuses the moths that lay eggs that become tomato hornworms. The strong scent of basil masks the tomato smell, and those moths fly right past without finding your plants. Marigolds attract beneficial insects and pollinators. This creates an ecosystem around your tomatoes instead of a monoculture. The bottom line is this: giant tomatoes require everything to be dialed in. You can't skip the soil prep and expect fertilizer to compensate. You can't plant in partial shade and hope extra water makes up for it. You can't use the wrong variety and think pruning will save you. Each factor builds on the others, and when you optimize all of them together, that's when you get tomatoes that make people stop and stare. Growing tomatoes that break records isn't about luck or secret tricks. It's about understanding what these plants actually need and refusing to cut corners. Start with proven genetics and proper soil, then work through every technique on this list. That 8-pound world record keeps getting broken, which means there's still room at the top. If you loved this video, you'll love the next one even more. Hey mate, thanks for watching, and let me know what's been your biggest struggle with growing plant in your garden.